make sure it's kosher. Lean on me like Bill Withers until you smell the roses.
What's happening, fam? L.A.R. movement still moving. Subscriber diatribe. You see the thumbnail, man. Like how are we supposed to deal with different generations of the drug war, the war on drugs, whatever you want to call it, right? Because I can't speak for the, I really can't speak for what happened in the '70s because I was born really at the tail end of '79. But from the '80s, '90s, 2000s, 2010s to now in 2020s. We have different generations. People who were in the 80s, that was really the beginning of the end because that was the quote unquote get money era, for the most part, where is it like people were making a lot of money, right? That's where that was at the 80s. For me, in my childhood, the violence was ramping up, you know, in the late 80s. So some of these people who I'm hustling, that there were people making money, and there were people who were getting extremely violent in the streets in the '80s. Then the '90s, you know, the drug laws changed, and when that happened, people were making less money, but people were still in the streets per se. But the violence really, really kicked it up a notch because now it's like it was oversaturated. So the gang violence kicked up, the territorial violence kicked up, and that was kind of the beginning of gentrification, in my opinion, right? So it was that thing, 2000s. Two, I forget if it was the late '90s or early 2000s when if y'all watched the movie series BMF. That's basically that. When Media got locked up, there were still people moving. Don't get it twisted. But um, 2000 was more of the rappers talking about what happened in the '80s and '90s. And it kind of dying down a little bit because the penalties were just extremely high. Like the juice wasn't worth the squeeze out of it. That's what it started to become. That's when you saw old gangsters getting into the music industry, type of thing, or being part of other industries, trucking and all the other stuff, construction, because people were getting out and having to restart themselves. So 2010s, in some ways, it was more like, it was the drug addict era. I would like 2000s went from the drug dealing era to the drug user era, and the 2010s, in my opinion, was just the drug addict era. And now it's 2020s, it's drug addicts slash scammers, right? So that's just my process of what I've seen. So in that, you've got different generations of children that became adults. From the people in L.A., they used to run the tanks through people's houses, you know, um, all the way to the DMV, where, who was that? It was the Avenue E, when they was behind was that the fire station, boosting everything in the city. That was when, the reason why I bring up the DMV because, they had the Dare Say No to Drugs campaign, and George Bush put the, this is crack cocaine commercial across, the world, and the projects was right behind the White House at the time. So it was like, yeah, you just went couple blocks over to get that, man. Like, stop it. South, South was like get money areas, in certain southern towns because it's lower cost of living. In the Midwest, whoo, it got violent, bro. Whoa. So I remember. So what I've seen is you had the kids who grew up in that, and they were a little harder individuals, and then subsequently a generation of people who maybe are still in the streets now. Because I know of people who are still in the streets now. Their kids are not necessarily in the streets, but the family is so hood that the kid gets it by proxy, and they try to act like they're tougher than they are, but they're really just a kid who never really had to do that kind of stuff. And then you have the generations of people who now they're out for real, but the suburbs have turned people into drug addicts because and what I don't understand about it is, this common thing about I'm going through so much anxiety and trauma, and you got people who, in my opinion, never really were traumatized because they never really been through anything. But any little thing, any paper cut they got in life caused them to, you know, smoke weed and drink lean and pop pills. And it's like, oh man, shut your soft self up. But then you got to take it to the government part of it. And over these years, I've seen people who, how can I do this? You've seen cops who went from war, having a war on drugs and criminals to cops busting criminals, to cops robbing criminals, to cops, you know, having major drug busts but skimming off the top. I know y'all seen Training Day and y'all think that was just a movie scene, but no, that's how people. There are people in plenty different cities and states that are police officers who had these big busts and wind up with all kinds of extravagant stuff afterwards. You trying to figure out how do you do that? It wasn't just overtime, you know. That's why I said it used to rob cats, and the government itself, marijuana used to be the gateway drug, and now you're legalizing it some 40 years later, 30, 40 years later, and now you're making money off of it, and most of the country is potheads, which is weird. Just 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 for the record, it's weird, and y'all think it's okay, but there's gonna come a time where they're gonna legalize something else, a little bit stronger, just for the record. That's how the opioids gotten into the lexicon because of morphine. People getting high off of those or using those opioids and after they take surgeries or have injuries, and then they get hooked and they need a and they start looking for strong heroin basically. The drug laws have always been uh, affecting more black people and then Hispanics. White people have always been getting off, so it's not a big thing to see white people get off for being major drug dealers. That's not cops don't bust white people like that. You know, they let white people operate, move and operate with pretty much not necessarily impunity, but with a whole lot of wiggle room. So that really hasn't changed. But over all this time, you start seeing how the outlaw mentality has really went into overdrive because people have glorified it to the point where you can be a person who grew up in that era and in those areas and your kids and grandkids are not, but they really want to be that, but they would never take the car and go to the rough side of town in their city to actually live there. They might go there on safari or go watching the people and acting like they down with I'm here in the hood with everybody, but they're not gonna live there. So you have that element, and the irony of it is, you know, how let me say it this way: how over time we've watched how there's a certain window of people who are not gonna get busted. Like I've lived in college towns. If you're in Baton Rouge, they'll bust you in, what was it, Baker, Scotlandville, and all that. They'll bust you out there. You know what I'm saying? Back in the day, I don't know about now, but if you were anywhere around LSU, that was one of the top party schools in America. Guess what? They're not busting people for that for nothing. Nothing. No, no. Think about even in the Ivy League schools. They'll bust you in Boston, but they won't bust you at Harvard. It's just, it was just Roxbury or whatever. Same thing, you know, in Atlanta. Like you don't hear these stories popping off at Georgia Tech. You know what I'm saying? So, or go further, Auburn or is that Auburn? I want to say it's Auburn. You know, you don't hear those stories. No, Auburn's in Alabama. I'm tripping. I mean, University of Georgia. I'm sorry. In Athens. That's what I'm thinking about. But over the years, you see how this happens, and it happens over and over and over again. So generations has changed, and people think, people my age are like, I wouldn't be caught with such and such. That's it. Younger people are like, it's not a big deal. And it's like, are you? Is it just because you're young and stupid, or is just the era that your generation is in? And usually it's the era, and sometimes it's the race. Because I remember I went to a football camp in high school, and our roommates was Amish kids, and the cops caught them with about an ounce of weed, but they just let them go, and they was like, "We do this all the time. No, we never go to jail," and we were just looking like white people. But I'm gonna leave it at that, man. This is a longer one. Tell me what you think. Like, share, subscribe, or die. Try and catch y'all on the next one. Peace.